Hello, welcome to Z Marie Design. Let's create a sweatshirt designer jacket transformation. You'll create your sweatshirt jacket transformation to be as unique as you are. I added a few embellishments, but you don't have to do that. I'll just show you the basics of how to create your transformation. So your jacket transformation begins with a sweatshirt as the foundation. Make sure it's at least 2 times larger than the size that you wear. Remember, we're making a jacket, so we want it a little oversized. First thing that you'll do is find the center of your jacket and cut down the center. You'll also cut off the ribbings from the arm, wrist, from the neckline, and from the bottom. But save that ribbing because it can be used for other upcycle projects. I'll leave a link in the description box for additional projects. You'll also cut off the sleeves. And you should have 2 sleeves now, and you should have 1 jacket that lies flat as the jacket of the sweatshirt. So decide on the fabric and the design colors that you want to use. I'm beginning with a half square triangle block from a previous project, as well as using some upcycled quilt bounding. So using the foundation piecing technique, I'm going to use this half square triangle piece and create a log cabin quilt block. So I'll start at the top of the block and I'll go all the way around from left to right, and I'll continue to fill in with those binding strips. I'll put one down, sew it, fold it over and press it, and continue on with that until my entire sweatshirt is covered. I also put the half square triangle block on each of the front, but instead of making those vertical lines, I did something a little different and I put them at an angle just to create more interest. After my sweatshirt is completely covered, I turn it over and you see all of the stitching where I put the binding strips down. Next, I will trim all of those binding strips and I'll use my sweatshirt as the pattern piece. So trim all the way around the sweatshirt. At this point, it should look like this. You can now just add some binding strips to the neck, to the arms, and the front and the bottom, sew up your shoulder seams, and you'll have a vest. But we're going to continue to create a jacket. So before sewing up our shoulder seams, while everything is still lying flat, we're going to add some embellishments. I'm going to embellish this with some decorative stitching and some free motion stitching. This is what the back of the sweatshirt jacket is, what it would look like right now. So you see all of the decorative stitches that I've added. Use all of the decorative stitches that you have on your machine. I'm sewing with a Bernina 880 Plus. I also use some free motion stitching And don't hesitate to experiment with your stitch length and your stitch width, just to see what the different decorative stitches will look like if you change it. I also used a variety of thread colors that would complement the fabrics that I'm using. Just adds more interest and more detail to the jacket. Next, onto my sleeves. So you're going to cover your sweatshirt sleeves using your binding strips. I put my binding strips at an angle just to add more interest. And once I had the sleeve completely covered, it looks something like this. So I turn it over to the back, and using the sweatshirt sleeve as a pattern, I cut out the binding strips that I have laid out, and I cut them out to the shape of the sleeve. And it should look something like this. Once again, I'm going to add and embellish with my decorative stitching and my free motion stitching. So I'm going to add an applique design that I sketched out, and I traced the design to a fusible web and cut it out with the fabric of my choice, and appliqued it using a blanket stitch and zigzag stitch to the back part of the t-shirt design. So this is what the back of my sweatshirt looks like with all of my applique that I designed that I added. Now you don't have to add this, or you can add something different, an applique design that's different. So this is what the back of my sweatshirt looks like with all the stitching. But I wanted to have a more clean finish, so I'm going to add a lining to the back to the jacket for a more finished look on the inside. So I laid out this plaid fabric that I'm going to use for the lining, and using the sweatshirt as the pattern, I cut out the lining for the jacket. And I also cut out a lining with the same fabric for my sleeves, using my sweatshirt sleeves as the pattern. So pinning with wrong sides together to the sweatshirt part of the pattern, and with the lining part of the fabric, I pinned it together, and I'm going to sew all the way around that sweatshirt. And I used a decorative stitch to do this, just so I can make that lining fabric and that sweatshirt fabric one piece. So all the way around, all of the edges. And I did the same on my sleeves. You see my wavy line there around the edges? That's my decorative stitch that I chose to use. So I want to add a little length to the sweatshirt jacket. So I'm going to put a bottom band on the jacket, and this could be any width that you want. I'm working with some upcycled binding, so my binding measures 3.5 inches wide. I'm going to add interfacing to this strip. And you see that seam and that crease in the center? I folded it over and pressed it in half. And then I'm also going to press just on one end of that strip, I'm going to press a 1/2 inch. That will be my seam allowance. And you see where that strip is folded at the top there? That'll be a seam allowance when I turn it over. So pin this right sides together along the bottom part of your sweatshirt. And that's what you'll sew. And you see my 1/2 inch seam allowance, so when I turn it over, I'll have a clean finish there. But sew that band down in place. And that should be the length of the bottom of your jacket. That band should be. So now I will turn it over and I will press that in place. I'm not going to turn it over and sew it just yet because I want to put plackets along the center front so I can add buttons later on. So for right now, just sew that bottom part of that band, just press it down there. And so the placket sizes that I'm going to have 6.5 inches wide. And again, I'm working with upcycled binding, so I sew 2 strips of binding together to create this 6.5 inch wide placket. And I pin it to the front of the sweatshirt from the top center all the way down to the bottom of that band. And I'm going to sew that in place. And I'm sewing everything with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I also made sure to add interfacing to that placket. So once my placket is all sewn, I'm going to turn it over and I'm going to press it in place. And I also pressed a 1/2 inch seam allowance on this one like I did on that bottom band too. You see where I have those seam allowances pressed in? So it should look something like this. Next, I'm going to fold that bottom band up just so that seam allowance meets that seam that I sewed the bottom band up on with. To cover that, I'm going to fold that bottom band in first, and then I'll fold that placket over, and that 1/2 inch seam allowance, it's going to also meet right up with the seam that I sewed to sew the placket on. Before you do this step, make sure to sew both sides of your placket on both sides of the front. Sew those on first. Then you will fold that bottom band in and fold over that placket on both sides. You'll see in just a minute that I have it on the other side as well. Then I'll pin this in place and I'll sew this down. You can hand stitch this, or you can sew this down with machine. I sewed it down with a decorative stitch, and I did 3 rows of decorative stitching to attach both my placket and my bottom band. So that's one side of the front placket and the bottom band that's sewn on, and it gives a nice clean finish on the front. And the other side of the center front, that placket and that bottom band, it gives a nice clean finish. The bottom band folds in first and the placket folds over that. So next we're going to sew our center seam, our shoulder seam, and we're going to right sides facing. And I put my wonder clips in because it's a little thick here. And I serged my edges because again I want a clean finish, but you can feel free to zigzag it or use your pinking shears. I put it on my dress form, or you can try it on, because I want to be able to know where my plackets are going to sit when I'm ready to do my buttons. And you see that clean finish that you get on the lining part of the jacket. I won't sew my buttons on until the very last part though. Next, I wanted to do a standing collar on mine. You can do some bias binding on this part too, but I'm going to do a little standing collar. So I measure all the way around that neck opening, and then again using some upcycled binding that I already have, I measure out that neck opening and I cut my collar part, that piece of binding, I cut it to that length. And once again, I'm going to press over a 1/2 inch hem allowance. And I also added some interfacing to this because I wanted that collar to be a little bit stiffer. So I'm going to put my collar on and sew it all the way around. And once I have it sewn, I'm going to come back and I'm going to snip all the way around the corner. Snip up to your stitching, but not through your stitching. And you're going to snip all the way around your collar, just so that when you turn it in, it'll lie a little flatter on that seam. So press that seam that you just snip, press that over, and then you're going to pin it down and you're going to stitch that collar down. And I used a blanket stitch, another decorative stitch, to sew that part down. So now my collar is on and the inside of my neck lining has a clean finish. So now on to the sleeves. I wanted to add a cuff to my sleeve. So again, using some upcycled binding, I'm going to press over another hem allowance of a 1/2 inch. And again, I added interfacing. And with right sides facing, I'm going to put that at the bottom part of my sleeve. Make sure that you have some overhang at this part so that when you trim a little, after you stitch it here, once you trim the sleeve, it won't be too short. So pin that in place. Again, I'm using my Wonder Kit clips because it's getting a little bulky here. And then I'm going to sew on my cuff. And then this way I have that hem allowance there. When I turn it over, that hem allowance meets right up with that seam line, and then I sew it down. And then we'll trim. I'll show you in the next step. So once you have sewn that cuff on, fold it over and you press it down. See, I have lots of overhang. That hem allowance, you're going to fold it up to that seam line, and you can hand stitch this in, but once again I'm going to use my decorative stitches, and I did 3 rows of decorative stitches again on that part of the cuff. Now that we have our cuff sewn on, it's time to trim. So with your ruler, I'm going to measure that side seam there. I'm going to measure where my sleeve is. And before I do any cutting, I'm going to mark it first. I'm going to mark where to make sure that it's even. And I want to make sure that it fits on my arm before I actually do the cutting. And this way I can make any adjustments that I need in the seam sewing line before. So fold that over and pin it in place and try it on your arm before you actually trim anything and sew it down. If it fits nicely, then you cut on that marked line and you sew your side seams. And again, I searched my side seams because I'm looking for a clean finish on the inside. Feel free again to zigzag this seam or to use your pinking shears. Turn your sleeves right sides out and we are almost done with this transformation. So your seam line is your underarm. Fold it, so press it over so that you can find your shoulder seam and mark it with a pin or with a marking tool. And with your jacket wrong side out, you will insert the sleeve inside the jacket, inside your armhole, with right sides facing. Find your underarm seam. And remember, there is no side seam on the sweatshirt, so find that side seam and mark it. With the side seam that we've sewn for the underarm, pin it in place. We marked our shoulder seam on our sleeve, and we have our shoulder seam that we sewed on the jacket. Pin that in place, and then continue to pin all the way around that sleeve opening there. And if you have to do any easing, this way you'll make sure that your shoulder seam and your underarm seam are in the right places, but you can ease in on the sides. And you'll do this for both sides of your sleeves. Once it's all pinned in place, you will sew all the way around your sleeve opening. And again, I serged mine for that clean finish. You can also do some bias binding on this seam if you like. Both of our sleeves are done and all set in. And now our jacket transformation is complete. Pull your sleeves through. And give your jacket a really good steam press. I love making sweatshirt jackets, and I have several in lots of different colors and lots of different styles. It's a quick and easy way to create a jacket, and a quick and easy way to use a lot of upcycled scraps from your material. So now at this time, now that that part of the jacket is done, I'm going to try it on again and space out where I want my buttons. And following your machine's buttonhole instructions, you will create your buttonholes based on the size buttons that you are using. Sew on your buttons on one side of the placket. My buttons are on my right side and my buttonholes are on my left side. After I did my buttons after this point, I added some additional embellishments. So on the applique faces that I've created, I added some eyelashes because you see they don't have any eyes at this point. I added eyelashes because they're both winking at us. And I also added some buttons or some pins for extra added embellishments, and I just glued those on. I added some upcycled earrings to each of my girls as well. And you see my buttons that I added. And this is what the back looks like. I also gave her an eyelash, and I also did an upcycled earring. And then I added some glitter glue just to add additional glitter. That other sequins that you see in her face, that's a part of the fabric. It's some sequin fabric that I had. But with the decorative stitches, with the glitter glue, with all of the applique details, with the beading of the earrings, it just makes it really unique. It makes it you. So just be as creative as you like at this point. And this sweatshirt jacket, they're very warm, and you feel free to add, make it as long as you like for the sleeves and for the bottom band. See how nice and clean it and finished it is on the inside? You have just a small little collar on there. You can make the collar as tall as you like by making your band as wide as you want. You can also add pockets to the inside or to the outside of this jacket. But I hope you like this sweatshirt transformation designer jacket. I hope you give this project a try. Thanks for watching.